The ultimate achievement for a broadcaster is to be in equal demand on both sides of the microphone, as host and guest. Since the 1960s, when he left Ireland to do his first radio shows for the BBC, Sir Terry Wogan has been one of the most recognisable voices and faces in Britain. Presenting the Radio 2 breakfast show for 28 years, in two spells divided by a full-time TV career that included Blankety Blank and the thrice-weekly Wogan Chat Show on BBC One. His radio work in particular set new standards of fluency, verbal inventiveness, and long before social networking technology, interaction with the audience.
The two autobiographies which I've read, a frequent theme is that you, incredibly lazy, always took the path of least resistance. And yet this does, as you know, this always amazes people because for long periods you were on radio and TV simultaneously, continuously, constantly. My conclusion is that you disguised the drive and ambition beneath this affable demeanour.
That probably credits me with a bit more intelligence than I have, to be honest, Mark. Yeah, maybe. Years ago, I went back to Ireland and was talking to a friend with whom I'd worked in the bank. And he said, people are always saying to me that you must have had some kind of determination, that you must have had some drive. He said, but I never saw it. And he was right. I don't really have enormous drive. I've never knocked on anybody's door and asked them for a job. What I've had is a kind of blessed life, if you like. I've been enormously lucky. Doors have opened for me without my knocking on them.
But you hadn't been cautious, though, because looking at periods in your life, there was a time when you were broadcasting in both Ireland and London, commuting. The Wogan Chat Show, it's 3 nights a week, first person. I mean, these are not the decisions of a cautious person. There is some drive there.
Yeah, whether it can be identified as drive. I'm not cautious about my career. I'm cautious about my family. I'm cautious about my life. But I've always taken risks in my career. I often say to Helen, my wife, that if I were older, or if it was now, I probably wouldn't have taken the chance of leaving Ireland, where I had a reasonable career and making a bit of money, to come across to Britain and work for the BBC for less money than I was making in Ireland. When I came here to work first for BBC on daily radio base, it was £135 a week. That was for a daily radio show. And it's a far cry. But so I used to go back every second weekend and do some commercial radio programmes in Ireland to keep my income boosting. And for a while, when I was actually working on Late Night Extra for Radio 1, I was living in Ireland. I was the most travelled DJ in the world. I used to fly back and forward from Ireland to London once, twice a week, even during the foot and mouth outbreak, in which case, you know, I used to have to walk through fine sprays of disinfectant to get back to Ireland.
But I've always been struck from the outside in you that there is a basic stubbornness and a determination to show people, because my theory is one reason that when you came back to Radio 2, it did become the huge success it became, is that you were determined to show people, because a lot of people wrote you off after the Wogan TV show. Similarly, when the BBC cancelled your TV contract, you turned up on Channel 4. There is something in you that wants to show them, isn't there?
There is something in me, not necessarily that wants... I have enough confidence. I don't really feel the need to show anybody anything, but I'm not going to be defeated. I don't recognise failure, or I bypass it, if you like. I don't dwell on it. I get on with it.
You once said something to me when I was a young broadcaster. I met you at one of those so-called BBC talent events. It was Wimbledon. And you said something which I've always thought, and as time has gone on, was one of the wisest things I ever heard about broadcasting. You said television is about novelty and radio is about familiarity and repetition. And for that reason, it's easier to have a longer career in radio than TV. But that is borne out, isn't it? I mean, there is something...
Absolutely true. I mean, I said something that was absolutely true, which is not entirely my forte. But, yeah, I love radio because I can impose my own pausing on it. I can impose my own timing on it. And because people think while they're listening to the radio. Television eschews thought. Your thinking is done for you, your imagination is done for you. And you can't really pause too much, otherwise the director will take the camera off you thinking you've had a heart attack. So you don't have the same degree of freedom. It was always a sort of forlorn hope of mine that I could somehow transcend the picture, get into people's minds, heads, in the same way, on television, in the same way that I could on radio. But I don't think it's possible.
Except I was thinking about this. You see, I think this is why the Eurovision Song Contest became such a big thing for you. Because it was a curious hybrid, that. It was as if you were doing a radio show on television. Very occasionally, we'd get a little shot of you in the box with your headphones on. But essentially, you were the disembodied voice, but anchoring a TV show, which is very unusual.
Yeah, and I think that's why it worked, because they didn't have my face all over it.
Reggae, okay, okay.
Well, you can't say you're not getting a variety of costume here. Good to see the old accordion coming into reggae music, isn't it? That's for Finland. Reggae okay. A couple of years ago, when Graham took over, it was the first time in 35 years that Helen and I were able to sit together and watch the Eurovision Song Contest. Slightly unnerving experience. I hadn't realised exactly how bad it was. Because when you're there, of course, you're taken up in the whole excitement of it.
Although, again, you see, you were a pioneer in this respect, I think. There's lots of talk now about ironic broadcasting, and so much of it goes on. But actually, Blankety Blank and the Eurovision Song Contest were examples of ironic broadcasting, that you were sending it up, even while being part of it.
That's right. The Europeans never, as you know, Europeans don't understand irony any more than Americans do. They don't get it.
Because some of the European countries would get really quite angry about your attitude, wouldn't they?
Yes, they thought we weren't, or that the British were not giving sufficient respect to this major, and it is a major show. It's extraordinary. I mean, 3.5 hours or whatever of perfect television, brilliantly staged. We perhaps don't give them enough credit for that. But what I did find was that I became very unpopular in Denmark a few years ago because the two presenters on Danish television, staging the Eurovision, did every introduction as a rhyming couplet, which, frankly, I thought was a mistake.
Let's go. On with the show.
Let's start the music.
Let's start the fun. The Eurovision Song Contest 2001.
Not before time. And I nicknamed them Dr. Death and the Tooth Fairy. And so, really, if I go through Copenhagen nowadays, I have to go with a paper bag over my head. But yeah, whenever I used to go to various places in Europe, they would always say, if you don't like the Eurovision Song Contest, why do you do it? It's just a difference, as I say. They miss irony, sarcasm, different sense of humour.
Well, they cheer anything here. 38,000 people here, half of whom can't see anything. And I'm in that majority. I'm watching it on a television like the rest of you.
We need to talk about Ireland. The first thing, obviously, is the language, which has been a large part of your career. I mean, people use that shorthand of Blarney, but there is, and this comes out in your autobiographies, there is something about speech in Ireland. It's very colourful, it's self-mocking, mocking others, and yet you can get away with a lot if you, as an Irish person, because the tone, the overall tone is friendly.
Yes, the Irish have that piquant mixture of cynicism and sentimentality. But the language comes because we're taught two languages. Because Gaelic, which you had to speak when or at least learn when I went to school, is full of flowery expressions. And that has seeped into the Irish use of English, which is why I suppose we get so many wonderful writers and poets
But you had that double thing growing up in Ireland, that there was the literature of Flann O'Brien that everyone loved and read, and then there was this other literature that was dangerous and banned. I mean, James Joyce in particular, because the Catholic Church had a huge list of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, all these books that were banned.
Exactly. I went to the same school as James Joyce, with Belvedere in Dublin, and almost directly opposite, in Great Denmark Street, is where the family used to live. But nobody in Belvedere ever spoke of James Joyce. There was one priest who used to say, he's a wonderful writer, you should read him if you can. But, of course, he fell foul of the Index, as so many others. It was extraordinary, but it was indicative of the kind of power that the Roman Catholic Church had in Ireland, and that has since largely dissipated.
You say in the autobiographies that the only comparison for the power that the Catholic Church had in Ireland when you were growing up there was the Ayatollahs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was true, and has been true, right almost up to the 80s. Ireland was in thrall to the Roman Catholic Church. The government, because it had no money, abrogated its responsibility in education. So it left education at the common level to the Christian Brothers, and at a middle-class level to the various orders, like the Jesuits, Holy Ghost Fathers, Dominicans, Redemptorists.
You've spoken and written about beatings. It was quite a savage environment, particularly.
Well, it wasn't that savage. It was savage if you were being educated by the Christian Brothers. But if you were protected slightly by a middle-class upbringing, the Jesuits didn't beat you insensible or give you a thump around the ear with a fist. They had a more sophisticated way of doing it. You go home, do your homework, make a mistake in your Latin homework. The priest would say, okay, and he'd give you a little chit, which said six biffs for doing wrong in your homework, which is tough, you know, come on. And you had to wait. This would be the first lesson in the morning, and you would have to wait until lunchtime before you had to line up, anticipating all morning, before you had to line up with your little chit, and then you put your hand out and got 6 leathers.
But then you, in one of the books, you talk about going home with your hands swollen
exactly,
and red.
on your little bicycle. Yeah, because it wasn't a boarding school, it was a day school. So I used to cycle home for my lunch. But, you know, I suppose it's only in retrospect that I think that was in any way damaging, because it wasn't. It was what you expected. It was what school was about. You didn't, you know, it made you work harder. It made you work harder at your Latin. In fact, I got fantastic marks in my Latin in the intermediate exams. And then when I went up to Dublin and things were a little gentler, I didn't really achieve anything like it.
But at the religious level, the Jesuits failed with you because you were an agnostic or an atheist really by quite a young age.
I can never really distinguish between the two. I'm not against all knowledge, so I'm not agnostic. But I have difficulty with the idea of an almighty God keeping his eye on me. But it came, I suppose the watershed for me came was when I was in Belvedere in Dublin, and we finished, did all our exams. And then we went on a retreat outside Dublin, Rathfarnham or somewhere, to a Jesuit retreat. And the priest got up on the first night and he said, remember, boys, he said, it's almost impossible to commit a mortal sin. And I thought, why didn't somebody tell me this 5 years ago? As far as I'm concerned, I've been committing mortal sins every 10 minutes. You know, you were brought up with this idea of sin. Sin was never very far from the corner. And the main sins, of course, were sex and vanity. Vanity was a big sin. So how any of us in Ireland grew up with self-esteem, I'll never know.
One of the legends of Catholicism, as you know, particularly Irish Catholicism, is they say, oh, he'll come back to it, he'll call for the priest at the end, they say.
Yes. Yes, they do say that. And maybe I will. Because, you know, let's keep all the exits open. But maybe it's arrogant. So when you think that St. Augustine and the great saints, the fathers of the church, highly intelligent men, all believed in God, it would be, it's arrogant for somebody like me of my limited intelligence to think that I don't. But I have a difficulty in accepting that. I don't have what they call the gift of faith.
I was amazed. One of the first times I went to Ireland, I watched the Gay Byrne show, who was, in a way, the Irish Terry Wogan. He's the one that stayed and did those chat shows. There would be priests and cardinals in the front row on his TV show. And it struck me that if you'd stayed, you couldn't have been the kind of broadcaster you've been.
He did an immense amount of good, though, really. He broke a lot of molds, which wasn't easy. And indeed, because there was no forum for opinion in Ireland, actually television and radio over the years created a kind of forum where opinions that people had been afraid to express suddenly were being expressed. But as far as working in Ireland, I worked in Ireland for 8 years on radio and television, that's successfully. But I suppose I was a bit of a West Brit. When I was growing up in Limerick, I didn't listen to Irish radio. I used to listen to the night programme, the Goon shows, Take It From Here, all those things. And most of my reading material, which my Auntie May used to send me every week, was Just William, Billy Bunter, and moving up that English thing. So I suppose in a way I had more in common with British radio and television than I had with Irish.
And your Auntie May, she was another great contributor to the language that you've used as a broadcaster and a writer, because she was sending you those books. I mean, she gave you an education in literature.
She did. She gave me another world. She would send me a couple of books every couple of weeks. She was the manager of a bookshop in Dublin. She was my godmother. It was a Catholic bookshop, so I didn't get any racy stuff.
But there are always, in life, there are all these pieces of luck, and that was one of the pieces of luck, that you had an aunt who not only ran a bookshop, but wanted to send you the stuff.
That's right, yeah. But then luck has played an enormous part in my life. And anybody who's successful and who denies that they were lucky to get where they are is a fool, in my opinion, because it plays a disproportionate role in all our lives.
Parents, Rose and Michael Wogan. Now, your father, and this is a good little parable, actually, a very hard worker who eventually, a lot of people aren't, but he was eventually rewarded for his hard work and diligence.
He had an enormous capacity for hard work. He would come home from running the grocery store in Limerick, and he'd spend most of the evening doing his books. He was meticulous. His handwriting was meticulous. He took pains. And he was a fisherman. And he took more joy out of preparing to fish, tying flies for the fly fishing, than he did in actual fishing. I would sit with him in a field, listening to the corncrake, eating my sandwiches, and he'd still be tying the flies. And just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the hedge, he decided he was going to fish. And that put me off fishing for life, really. And it obviously, although I loved him, it made me the kind of person I am, because I'm impatient. And I like to do things immediately, possibly too quickly. My whole broadcasting career is about opening the microphone without having a thought in my head and just risking it.
And you say in one of the books that if he'd been an accountant, you might have become an accountant. But because he wasn't a professional, he did a variety of things, and then eventually he was successful in trade. And
it was lucky for me. Certainly in Belvedere College in Dublin, most of the people, most of my peers, were the sons of doctors, accountants, executives, quantity surveyors, architects, and they all became architects. I went back to a reunion a couple of years ago, and they were, in fact, all accountants, architects, quantity surveyors, and doctors and surgeons. My father would have liked me to be a doctor, but I'm lazy. I did 7 years. actual studying and work. No. And so I went to work in a bank, the Royal Bank of Ireland, which was a small bank in Dublin, a small, largely Protestant bank. So I worked in the bank for 4 years, and happily, I had good people, nice people, being paid nothing. I do tell a story of the fact that when I worked in the bank, twice a week, I would have to carry £5,000 in used notes on the back of the number 19 bus down to head office, where they would be switched for new notes, another 5,000, which I would then take back on the back of the bus again, back to the branch. Now, how we were never knocked over, I will never know. Because sometimes I think, let's go to the porter, because he'd be with me. I say, let's go for a walk down to Leigh Street or something. We'd have the new notes in the bag, and we'd stop off at Bewley's Oriental Cafe and pop in there, put it under the table, and have a cup of coffee. Extraordinary.
But also, which is the impressive benefit of your upbringing, you were never tempted to take a few of the fivers.
No, and there was very little pilfering went on. Although there was a fella who came in to do an inspection, a senior man, who did run off with the money. But to everybody's astonishment, because that wasn't the way. That wasn't the way we were brought up. You know, we were honest, diligent, middle-class people who didn't boast and didn't have much sex.
And the move to broadcasting, that came via amateur dramatics. I mean,
I did a bit of
acting.
Nearly everybody in Ireland did Amdram. You know, so I joined the Rathmines and Rathgar Musical and Dramatical Society. And we used to sing on the stage of the Gaiety Theatre, where subsequently I went to do a Eurovision Song Contest once. So yeah, that was the outlet for whatever creative spirit you had, or showing off, that you were allowed to show off on the stage. But that wasn't it. I just picked up the Irish Independent newspaper one day, and there was an ad, and it said, Radio Éireann seeks announcer, newsreader, continuity announcer, newsreaders. The requirements are English, Irish, a familiarity with continental languages, and then and I wrote off, for some reason that still escapes me, filled out a form, because, you know, half of the country was out of work. So I would fill in this form, I'm sure with about 10,000 briefless barristers, out of work people. And extraordinarily enough, with the little qualifications I had, was called for an audition. Did the audition, because I'm a bit of a mimic, faked the Italian, the German, the French, got by on the Irish and the English, I was called for a training course. So I'd work in the bank all day, and then I'd go to Radio Éireann in Henry Street, the GPO in Dublin, and do a training course as an announcer, and blow me down, they offered me a job. And that was the beginning.
But that's another of these pieces of luck, that the thing you'd been good at school was languages, so you were, I mean, that was why you were able to answer that ad, really.
Yeah, but I still don't know why, because there would be fellas with PhDs applying for this job. This was a desirable job. This, you know, you were something if you were a continuity announcer, newsreader on Irish radio. It's amazing. I'm still astounded by the fact that I got called for an audition and then got offered the job.
And Irish broadcasting, it was a good preparation for what was going to happen later, in that it's the famous thing that you are very, very famous. I mean, at least at that stage, you were as a broadcaster in Ireland. So you were exposed to recognition and fame and judging beauty contests very early on.
I was indeed. Because no sooner had I joined Irish radio than Irish television started, around about 1961. And that was fantastic. They opened with an outside broadcast, which was a tremendously plucky thing to do. I mean, you know, if one of the batteries had fused, that was the end of it. And indeed, Irish television got by on a wing and a prayer, because all sorts of people came across claiming to be directors who, in fact, were road sweepers in Canada and Australia and places like that. But it happened, and Irish flair for doing things on their toes worked. When people say to me, you must find children in need 7 hours of live television, or doing what I do, which is always live, which making it up as I go along, you must find that very, very wearing and nerve-wracking. You wanted to have been with Irish television in the early days. Goodness sake.
Because you did one of the most disastrous live programmes in history, which is a game show called Jackpot.
Well, I wouldn't put it that strongly, but it was a bit troublesome, yes, because the very first one I did, nobody had really bothered to tell me what was going on. And, of course, in my nature was to say, oh, sure, I'll do it anyway. And, of course, a buzzer went, and I hadn't realised that was the end of the show. The show was over before I knew it. And then there were other occasions where the contestants had to delete or dip. So they could delete their opponent's point or dip into a little box in front of them and pull out a prize. So Mary says, I said, well done, Mary, good. Do you want to delete or dip? And she said, I'll dip. Fair enough, Ski. I said, go ahead. So she pulled it over. She said, there's nothing in here. There's nothing in here. And, you know, but there were so many other occasions. Somebody had the bright idea of doing what was called the vertical plan, which meant that various presenters were in charge of an evening. I was in charge of Friday. And so one evening I'm sitting there and I'm introducing this girl who's perched prettily on a stool with a guitar. And I said, and now here she is with Concerto de Aranjuez, Joan Phone, or whatever her name was. And this was followed by a tremendous crash because she'd fallen off the stool with the guitar. So there are few things more frightening than when that happens and a floor manager goes up in front of you and goes, 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Now, there isn't a thought in your head. You don't know what you're going to say. And then so you faff on for about 3 minutes, and then he goes, there's 2 more. So because the girl had obviously done herself a mischief. So these are nerve-wracking moments, and these do. And Irish television, I will always be grateful for it. It prepared me for the vicissitudes of what I endured when I came across to Britain. There was no auto cue.
And no earpieces either.
No earpieces. So it was you were always at the behest of the floor manager, fair enough. But when you're addressing a camera and you're trying to remember what your next lines are, and you're not in character as an actor, you take on the appearance of a frightened seagull. Your eyes glaze over because there's no room for expression. There's no room to interpret. You're desperately trying to remember what you've got to say next. And so it was a great godsend when I came across to British television and found that we have auto cues and all the rest of it.
Was it assumed at that time, as Eamon Andrews had made the journey from Ireland to... Was it assumed that to make it big in the way that clearly it was in Scotland in the 70s and 80s, that you had to leave, you had to go to London?
No, I don't think so. What drew me was, of course, the fact that I'd grown up with the BBC, and I wanted to see if I could make it. I really wanted to see, can I do it on the BBC? And Irish television and radio at that time, I was doing fine and all the rest of it, but I wasn't, in my opinion, going any place quickly. And so I sent off a tape to the BBC of a radio show I did. And luckily it was picked up by a man with a handlebar moustache, whose name was Mark White. He was assistant head of gramophone department. And I owe him everything, because this tape, when he got it, hadn't been re-spooled. So it was backwards. He actually took the time and trouble to re-spool the tape and listen to it. Now, that could never happen nowadays. That would never, ever happen now.
But looking back at your career, I was very struck that interactivity, which is the huge thing now because of the internet, and well, they have this phrase, don't they, in broadcasting now, user or audience-driven content. But you were onto that very early. I mean, even in Ireland, you did a show in Ireland, Terrier While, perhaps one of the worst titles in.
Get away with you. I thought that was very catchy.
But it was properly interactive. And you were one of the first people to do this, to encourage the audience to respond, and you would ring them up.
One of the first to use the phone. I mean, the phone is totally abused now. It's ridiculous. It's the forum for every eccentric and lunatic. And so I absolutely abhor that now. Phone-in programs, forget them. But at the time, it was quite fresh and new. And again, it was risky, of course. So I was relying on myself to actually carry that off. And I sent a tape of that to the BBC when the BBC was starting, or about to start, Radio 1. And that's what got me the job on Late Night Extra. So I used to fly back and forward between Dublin and London to do that on a Wednesday or a Friday. And that was a terrific program. I loved doing that because I worked with journalists, news coming in, music, comment. It was very, very good radio magazine program.
I was very struck by something you used to say in the 80s and 90s, which I'd never thought about until you said it, which is that you were an Irish broadcaster in the UK at a time when in Northern Ireland there was more or less a war going on and there were bombs going off in the streets of London. And you said that you thought it showed great maturity of the audience here, that it was never an issue. But I was interested, you thought there might be some sensitivity over that.
Well, I was amazed that there wasn't. I mean, after a bomb goes off at a pub in Birmingham, kills innocent British people, the following morning on a popular music network, an Irish voice comes up trying to be cheerful, and whose job it was to make people cheerful in the early morning. I was very conscious of that. But at the same time, I never felt it necessary to deny the fact that I was Irish. And subsequently, Irish people who had lived, as I did, in Britain during the worst of the excesses in Northern Ireland, have come up to me and said that I was a kind of help to them. But you see, nearly everybody in Britain knew an Irish person, was friends with an Irish person, and knew that, as I had said quite clearly, if this is not being done in my name, there is a tolerance here that was quite extraordinary, given the circumstances of people dying in IRA bomb activity. It was extraordinary.
But when you first came to London, there must still have been that notorious sign that used to be seen, no blacks, no Irish, in boarding houses, was almost certainly still there in some parts of Britain. Did you ever suffer any anti-Irish feeling here?
Never suffered, because I was in a privileged position. And in a sense, if you like, Eamon Andrews had beaten a path for people like me. So I was never, ever conscious, ever, of any anti-Irish feeling. There is no anti-Irish feeling in this country, even given the terrible things that have happened in the name of freedom in Northern Ireland. And indeed, it's reciprocated. It's extraordinary in view of the 800 years of terrible history that tolerance, mutual respect still exists.
And that first Radio 2 show, again, the interactivity, because you had the Fight the Flap campaign, and then when Dallas took off on TV, again, that was talking about something the audience were talking about.
The most important program on any radio network is the morning show, is the breakfast show. It identifies the network, and it's at the time when people are more susceptible, or more receptive, if you like, to what's going on. And so you have to reflect, I think, what they're actually looking at, or what they're listening to, or what they're involved with. And so all I did was try and reflect that. So when Dallas came on, I watched it. I found it insanely funny. And, walk-in wardrobes with wire coat hangers, the richest family in Texas with only one phone. And all those extraordinary anomalies where, again, rich beyond the dreams of avarice. And they had all their weddings and indeed parties in front of the garage on the drive.
Oh, they're my folks. I better go say hello.
But this is where the element of acting comes in, isn't it? That it didn't, particularly doing the breakfast show, if your knee was hurting or you had a cold or you were worried about one of your children at school or whatever, you could never show that. You had to be cheerful.
Absolutely. But I don't have a problem with that. My wife says I'm a bit of a bore in the early morning because I'm up. Maybe it's live imitating art. I don't know. But I never had any trouble. Again, it's the way you're brought up. It's the way you're educated. It's your job. You get up in the morning. It's your job to go in and cheer people up. If you walked into a doctor's with some kind of ailment, and the first thing the doctor says to you is, "Oh, I have a terrible pain in my stomach myself," that's no good to anybody. What I had to do was be cheerful, insofar as I could be myself. But I'm lucky that temperamentally, I'm okay in the morning. In fact, boring.
And actually, the only time I've ever heard you sound unhappy on air, I subsequently discovered that Paul Walters was ill, very ill, your producer, and it was the only time that I've ever heard that. But are you able generally to remain optimistic in the face of that kind of thing?
Yeah, I am an optimist. Yeah, I am. And anyway, you have to compartmentalize. You can't allow personal worries to intrude in the broadcasting. The public are not interested. They want to hear the same person doing the same thing every morning.
A lot of people do go mad with success. Your successor on Radio 2, Chris Evans, has been quite clear that there was a period where he completely lost it.
He did, but he's
in every way possible. But he's now, I mean, he's clearly turned himself around now.
I was very lucky. I had a career in Ireland. I was very famous in a small community because I was one of the first faces on Irish television. And for the first time, Ireland had its own public heroes, and I was one of them. So, you know, it stopped me going to a pub. I couldn't go to pubs anymore. It stopped me playing rugby because people were out to say, "Do you see that fella reading the news there? I gave him that black eye." And so I just stopped doing that. So it changed my life. But I did learn how to cope with it. I learned to cope as I was walking down Henry Street in Dublin, and somebody shouted, "There's Terry Wogan." And somebody else would say, "Very fat, isn't he?" These are the things that arm you against going mad. And so when I came to Britain, I'd been through that already, so I was able to cope with it.
And you, as far as we can tell, you seem to have avoided the showgirls and cocaine side of show business.
But I'm not telling you about it.
But were there ever what your old Jesuit teachers would have called occasions of sin?
Occasions of sin, yes, impure thoughts. Well, there was certainly, and it went on without my knowing it, because when I started to work for the BBC, within 2 or 3 years, there became a huge payola scandal on radio, where people were playing records for sexual favours, or for drink, or for parties, or for loose women, or for all that kind of stuff. Now, I was doing one of the major shows on the afternoon with an audience of about 6-7 million. Nobody ever came up and offered me a sexual favour. Nobody. And I didn't know whether to be complimented or offended by that, really.
Your Jesuit teachers would be pleased. It's obviously your character or your upbringing or something.
Maybe I look boring, that's what it is.
They got very into this thing in the 80s called bi media, and people used to go around saying, "Are you bi yet?" and all that kind of thing. But you always were, weren't you, really? I mean, you in Ireland, but then also in Britain, you tended to have radio and TV on the go at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's important. I always felt that if you wanted to really make a career or a living, you had to do both. You had to cross over. I was a natural, I suppose, at radio, but television is a much more difficult medium, and you can't be a natural at television. Nobody is. And so when I came across here, it took a while, and then Blankety Blank started. And that was the very first instance for me where I could achieve the same degree of freedom on television as I could on radio.
Good evening and welcome again to our warm and homely little quiz game.
I could talk and walk without wondering whether I was in the correct light, and I could make it up as I go along. And that was a watershed for me as far as television was concerned.
What's small and green and covered with red spots? With measles.
An unripe raspberry.
An unripe
Raspberry.
raspberry. Well, let's see how many points David gets with this one.
Wogan on TV, still sometimes in profiles of you, people refer to it as a failure or a flop. It's important to establish, I think, it was getting a huge number of viewers for a large number of years.
Yes, he used to get 8 million viewers, but those are in the Quandam days. Yeah, I think probably it got a certain amount of criticism because they felt that the questions were a bit banal. That's always levelled at all talk show hosts, but talk shows, chat shows, are cheap entertainment. They don't cost a lot to do. They're light entertainment. And the one I was doing, which perhaps was not fully appreciated, was live, you know, and really you were on your toes all the time. There was no space to edit. There was no room to take out somebody who wouldn't speak. There was no room to take out drunken behaviour.
Which you had with George Best.
Yes, and indeed Anne Bancroft, who came on in a catatonic trance. And I said to her, "You're not enjoying this much, are you?" She said, "No."
Why do you hate this kind of thing so much? Is it me?
Probably.
It's probably me. It's not the dried flowers or anything.
That too.
And dear George, he'd had a few. And you'd think the whole world had been watching it, rather than 8 million, because it was all over the papers. But he didn't mean any harm by it. He'd had a few drinks, and he was a nice man. He didn't mean me any harm.
Terry, I like screwing, all right?
All right. So what do you do with your time these days?
Screw.
I see. Ladies and gentlemen, George Best.
One of the most interesting bits is when you were talking to David Icke, this man who clearly was not in the best way mentally, I think we can probably say. I imagine now on most talk shows the audience would be turned against him. Now, you didn't do that. You say to him very gently, you say, they're not laughing with you, they're laughing at you. Fine.
I didn't mean that to be hurtful.
Terry.
I don't want you to misinterpret it. They're not laughing in sympathy with you.
That was an uncomfortable moment because you didn't really want to be talking to someone who was in that state.
That was the risk you took with live television. I mean, I used to find myself looking at people who wouldn't speak, thinking, what the hell are you doing on this show if you're not supposed to, you're not prepared to talk? Americans always found it difficult. It was live. There's nothing on American television is live. So,
They have this odd phrase, don't they, taped as live.
yeah, come on. Yeah, you can edit out all the stuff. But that was the risk I took, and it worked for about eight and a half years.
And if it wasn't as good a fit for you as radio shows, because I think you prefer not to prepare, don't you? And I mean, I know a producer who worked for you, and he said he just felt you were uncomfortable. They would have these briefs, and they would want to go through the questions, and that's not how you want to work.
No, but of course I wasn't in a strong enough position to assert that at the time. If I was doing it now, it'd be different. I do have a belief that you should have enough intelligence or general knowledge to be able to conduct an interview with anybody who comes on. You should know your stuff. Obviously, belt and braces, BBC, there wasn't enough trust in me, in a sense, to carry an interview longer. We would get a very interesting interview, but you'd have to cut it short because there was a musical item coming up and 2 more guests. And then sometimes you'd get a really famous guest who would last on, and you'd only have 3 minutes to talk to him. So I always found that frustrating, and I found the fact that it wasn't on every night frustrating. Not that I wanted to be on every night, but I couldn't preserve any continuity, and that, I think, was the difference between that and the radio. If I'd been able to do it every day and run an interview on and say, look, we're continuing on this, and it'll be on tomorrow night, or would you stay for a few minutes? that's what I wanted. I wanted more freedom, and I didn't have. But I mean, it was successful. I loved doing it. The problem was that I came to a point when I said, look, I think perhaps, as always with me, it's time we gave it a rest. And they said, no, you're doing splendidly for us. It's 150 hours of television, and it makes a hell of a difference to us, and we need it desperately. And meantime, they were building this village in Spain to replace me.
For El Dorado.
Which they never said a word to me about. And I thought, and in a sense, that's what molds you. You think, okay, that's never going to happen again. You know, I'll make my own timings. I'll leave when I want to leave.
But in the end, you were happiest as a broadcaster doing interrupted monologues, in effect. Monologues interrupted by the audience interacting rather than interviewing.
I thought I was okay as an interviewer. I mean, I took it lightly because I didn't think it was a serious form, not in what we were doing. It was a half an hour live, you had 3 guests, music item. You're not going to get an awful lot of time. You try and make it as light as you can. I had some wonderful guests, Leslie Nielsen and Dudley Moore. And I got to meet Gregory Peck, June Allison, Stuart Granger, James Stewart. You know, I wouldn't have met those if I hadn't done the show. So I don't regret doing it. In a sense, I regret that it finished as it did.
And you were angry with TV, weren't you?
I was angry with what had happened, as you would be. But I was able to re-establish my credentials with the Daily Radio Show. I got back into it, the public came back, and my credibility was re-established. But if it hadn't been for that, I could still be there. I could be doing Countdown.
But also those years on the Wogan TV show, you had an astonishing level of fame. I mean, it was difficult to go to restaurants. It was difficult. Your children, I imagine.
Yeah, it was
because
terrible.
You hadn't been. I mean, few people had been as exposed on TV as that.
No, that's true. That's true. It sort of passed me as the idle wind.
But it was difficult for your family.
It wasn't easy for my children. But they coped with it in their different ways. And I always feel that the old cliche, you know, if it doesn't kill you, it's going to make you stronger. And so they came out unscathed, but I did appreciate at the time. Nowadays, I think they're slightly more appreciative of me, but they're middle-aged people now.
But you gave them a very interesting piece of advice, which was that if anyone attacked you at school or said your dad's this, that, or the other, just agree with them.
Agree with them, absolutely. Turn away wrath. Yeah, oh yeah. There's no point arguing. Yes, you're absolutely right. You should try and live with him. That's what I used to say.
And a lot is said about the dangers of celebrity. The American writer John Updike had this great phrase about fame is a mask that eats into the face. Were you ever, were you ever aware or wary of being damaged by it all?
No, I always had my family. My philosophy has always been that this is what I do. I've been very lucky to find something I could do that suited me, that I was, I suppose, naturally gifted to do. I never look at myself. I never listen to myself. It's what I do. And so I do it, and then I go home and have my dinner. That's it. It's the most important thing in your life is your family. And that is my rock, if you like, my wife and my children. And nothing else really matters. You know, the rest, as I say, is just peripheral.
You talk about that time in Ireland, somebody shouting out, isn't he fat? That side of it, because being commented on by people, wait, or there's a TV critic who for 30 years has referred to you always as Terry wig on, which is his joke that he...
It's funny.
Yeah. Did you, were you ever affected by that, hurt by it?
No, you can't let stuff like that. You've got to move on. Move on. I mean, it's the worst thing they can ever say about you. That's okay.
And obviously I'm obsessed with this for clear reasons, but can we settle this, because it's gone on for so long, this?
Well, it's the kind of thing that if they can't think of anything else to say about you, they say that. Half of us on television are supposed to be wearing wigs. So I prefer to let people make their own decision.
Because of your general demeanour, you've got away with incredible things. You've been ruder about BBC management than I think any broadcaster.
Nonsense. No, I haven't.
You have?
Mark, I've only the highest respect for them. I tell you what we have got away with on Radio 2, with things like, that raised a ton of money for children in need, things like Janet and John stories.
Which were the filthiest things ever broadcast.
Yeah. I never quite understood them, of course.
Janet is just about to serve his food, and Janet says, "Did you have a nice time in the park?"
"Yes, I did," said John. "On the way, I fell off my scooter, and Mrs. Park saw me, took me into a shop to sort me out. She got the wood out and saw that I had a nasty scuff. So she got on her knees, rubbed some cream in it, and worked her fists up and down until I could see my face in it. She said it was a pleasure to find a man who wasn't afraid to splash out on a decent pair."
We could never have got away with it on Radio 4. It's just that, as far as the BBC is concerned, Radio 2, Radio 1, just popular broadcasting, you know. Not important. No opinion makers ever listen to it.
It's also something about you, though, isn't it, that if Jonathan Ross had read out those stories, the BBC would have been closed down. But there was something about the fact that it was you that diluted it somehow, Janet and John.
Well, yeah, but it all depends on the delivery. I always read them absolutely straight. And half the time in complete ignorance of what was going on. What used to astound me was the number of old ladies who got the jokes.
A broadcaster has to face the fact that it just vanishes, the stuff you've done. All those thousands of hours on Radio 2, which people greatly love, they're all just gone. Yeah. Do you just accept that, or do you ever regret that you didn't do something more permanent?
Dear old Paulie Walters, who was my great friend of mine and my producer, at the end of every show used to say, "Well, there it is, it's gone. On its way to Venus," he'd say. And you have to keep that attitude about what we do, because it's transient. Nothing is forever. And it's ephemeral. It's light entertainment. It's not meant to dwell. And equally, you have to accept the fact that when you're working in it, it's not a permanent pensionable position. If I'd wanted that, I would have stayed in the bank. So you move on. You don't look back. You just carry on. Hope for the best.
And there is this whole question of adjustment. I mean, you're not retired, but you gave up the morning radio show, Radio 2. Now, be honest about this. Was there a difficult period of adjustment when you gave it up?
I would be nothing else but brutally frank with you. No. To be honest, no. Because, as you said earlier, I'm a risk taker with my career. The only permanence I require is in my family. And so, of course, I miss the morning show. I miss the camaraderie. I miss the contact, the interfacing with the public. You know, 500 or 600 emails every morning. I knew what the public wanted. I knew what the public thought about everything, if you like, and I was able to build on that kind of correspondence. I do miss that. I miss that fun, but. You know, you can't. I've always been the kind of person that leaves parties early. My mother always said that I used to come in Elm Park, Limerick, when I'd finished playing and lock the gate behind me and go in the front door. And that's the way I've always been. And so I do try and make for the exit before people start leading me to it.
And that is very unusual. And I think that's important that it's virtually unique in broadcasting that you left the morning show at the time of your own choosing. Most people, we know, are dragged out kicking and screaming, aren't they? And resenting it and writing articles in the papers.
I know, it's pathetic, isn't it?
Yeah, but you're one of the very few people who was able to leave in the way you wanted.
I think, Mark, that's because I didn't come from a showbiz background. I haven't had to battle my way up from the bottom of the bill. I haven't had the classic insecurity of our business. I've always been secure. I've always had a reasonable self-esteem, and I've never starved. And so I have enough confidence to walk away when I think the time is right.
And this is it then. This is the day I've been dreading. The inevitable morning when you and I come to the parting of the ways.
And that final morning on Radio 2, again, I think, symbolically of your career in the BBC, there was a little bit of Barney there with BBC management, because one of them you said on air, but one of them said, aren't you overdoing the sentimentality a bit?
No, I don't remember that at all. I'm not saying I don't remember. I don't remember that. Yeah, obviously that was a thing I prepared. I wrote that down. I don't really write anything else down, but I wrote that down because I wanted to get that right. It was important to me to say goodbye in the right way. And it was a sad morning for me, very sad.
Well, you told me beforehand, as I asked you, you said you definitely weren't going to cry, but you did, didn't you?
There was a slight choke. Mark, I wouldn't put it higher than that. A little fogging of the eyes, yes. But, but you know, I'd invested an awful lot of time and an awful lot of broadcasting in years and years of morning radio. But it was time to say, you know, time to go before everybody gets fed up of you.
So, I'm going to miss you till we're together again in February. Have a happy Christmas. Thank you. Thank you for being my friend.
When you look at Sir Bruce Forsyth now, this huge show either side of his 80th birthday.
Bless him.
Do you sort of hanker after that? Would you like there to be another huge show?
I don't care. It'll happen or it won't. Probably not happen. I'm an old geezer now. Mind you, so is Bruce. But he can dance Trip the Light fantastic, a lot better than I can. And he's remarkable. It's wonderful to see. And I'm sure he'll go on and on. And I'll probably go on and on, doing little things. And maybe somebody will offer me something to do that's popular. Maybe it'll succeed and maybe it won't.
Finally, the other traditional temptation to the Irish is to return in their declining years, but you must have discussed that with Lady Wogan.
It's maybe someday I'll go back to Ireland. Only at the closing of my day. No. I love Ireland, but you want to be where your family is. All my family live in Britain. So yeah, we'll go back. We'll see my family, we'll see Helen's family, and they'll come to us. But I'm not sure that we'd ever want to live back there again. This is where we live. This is where our family lives.
Sir Terry Wogan, thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
From recent encounters to more memorable moments from the archives, famous faces in conversation, choosing their desert island discs. Listen now on BBC Sounds.